Okay.
Testing.
Good morning. This time I'd like to call to order.
Recording in progress.
I'd like to call to order the VTA Board of Directors meeting for Friday, June 16th, 2023. I'd like to remind everyone to take a moment to identify your nearest exit. Public restrooms are outside the double doors adjacent to the reception area. In case of an emergency, the address of our meeting is noted on the screen, and the nearest AED is in the hallway outside the chambers near the east wing. One of our colleagues is joining us remotely from Gilroy City Hall. As such, we'll conduct a roll call vote for all action items. To members of the public, welcome and thank you for attending. In-person attendees who wish to address the board are encouraged to complete a blue speaker card. Those are available at the public information table at the back. Please submit the completed card to the board office staff before the item is heard. Virtual attendees can use the raise hand function on Zoom or press 9 if you're dialing in. We'll be inviting those who attended in person to speak first, followed by those who are in Zoom. To my colleagues, please keep your mics muted until you're ready to speak, and please call my attention if you do wish to speak by raising your hand or turning on the red light on your mic. Having said all that, Elaine, would you please call the roll?
Abekoga,
Here.
Blankley, she has not joined us remotely just yet. Davis,
Here.
Dean, Foley,
Here.
Jane,
Here.
Jimenez, Kamei, Lee,
Present.
thank you, Lee Eng, Lopez, Mahan, Montano,
Here.
Rennie, Torres, Turner, Chavez, Thank you. Bert?
Here.
We have a quorum, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. So moving on to item 1.2, which is orders of the day. Are there any changes from colleagues? Okay. Seeing none. And I guess Member Blankley's still not logged in, right? Okay. Any changes from staff? Great. So we'll move on to item number 2, which is public comment on items that are not otherwise on the agenda. This portion of the meeting is reserved for persons desiring to address the board on any item within the board's jurisdiction, but which is not on the agenda. Speakers will have 1 minute to speak. We'll have up to 30 minutes for public comments. Those who are unable to address the board on item 2 at this time due to the 30-minute time limit will have an opportunity at the end of the meeting to do so under a second public comment period. The law does not permit board action or extended discussion on any item not on the agenda except under special circumstances. Those with customer service concerns are encouraged to contact our customer service department after you make your comments. Their contact info is on the screen. I'd like to remind members of the public who are speaking this morning to adhere to our rules when addressing the board. They're on the public speaker timer slide you see on the screen. If you want to address the board on matters not on the agenda, please submit the request to speak now. We'll start our public comments, and I see that we have these 2 cards. First is Laura Uden. Welcome.
My name is Laura Uden. I own a small, disadvantaged, disabled veteran firm. We're experts in project and quality management and worked on the BART Silicon Valley Phase 2 program, writing the quality management plan that was submitted for VTA approval and EPD funding. After delivering significant value on the program for 3 years, at the height of COVID, my firm was illegally substituted without cause at the instigation of VTA, breaking multiple state and federal regulations. It nearly put us out of business. We filed multiple complaints starting over 1,000 days ago, but the actions of VTA executives showed them to be incapable of conducting required oversight in accordance with regulations, unprepared to take discrimination complaints seriously, disinclined to investigate such complaints until recently, unavailable to meet with impacted businesses when VTA's own internal investigation found VTA to be complicit in the removal of my firm, and unwilling to resolve this complaint by discussing a solution when they found the complaint to be valid. I have another 2 minutes that I can share a little more information if you're able to take those comments. Otherwise, I'll be here at the end of the meeting if anybody wishes to speak with me.
Thank you. And we can take them in writing.
Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Doug Cheshire. Welcome.
Good morning, Chair Byrd, directors, and staff. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak this morning. My name is Doug Cheshire. I'm a field representative for Carpenters Local 405 here in Santa Clara County. Back on February 14th of this year, I submitted a letter to the board secretary in regard to our support for the Eterna Tower at 17 East Santa Clara Street here in San Jose, the same site that has been identified for the new BART station. In the letter, we encourage collaboration between the VTA and Roy Gabib Developments team to allow for design and construction of the fully entitled Eterna Tower and the VTA's downtown BART station on the same site. This model has been successfully incorporated throughout the world. BART, subway station below with the tower above. So why not now? The construction of the Eterna Tower will provide 192 units of much-needed housing, 20% of those below market rate, helping meet regional and state housing needs. Through collaboration on these 2 projects, good family-sustaining jobs will be created here in Santa Clara County, giving women, minorities, and at-risk youth the opportunity to start their career in the construction industry. So I stand before you this morning to ask that this matter be formally agendized in an upcoming meeting to hear from the developer and to find a pathway forward in partnership. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Do we have any other members of the public who wish to speak?
Chair, I don't see anyone in person, and I don't have anyone, actually, we do have one person on Zoom who has raised their hand. Tate, please accept the unmute and begin speaking when ready.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Thank you. My name is Tate Baugh. I'm an expert on public transportation. I just sent an email message to the VTA board yesterday, and I think I have an idea regarding the BART extension. Last week, I spoke to the MST board, Monterey Salinas Transit on Zoom, and they're planning to reinstate a bus route to provide service from Gilroy to Salinas this next fall. So here's my idea. I'm thinking about there should be a rapid bus route of VTA from Berryessa, North San Jose BART station to Gilroy Transit Center until the BART extension to Santa Clara opens, and then switch the VTA bus route, the rapid one of VTA, to provide service from 28th Street Little Portugal BART station to Gilroy Transit Center until California High Speed Rail opens its 2 stations in San Jose and Gilroy. That is all I have. Thank you.
Chair, there are no more hands raised.
Thank you. So we'll now close public comment for items not on the agenda, and our next item is number 3, public hearings. There are no public hearings. So now we move on to the consent calendar. Director Jane.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I would actually like to pull both items on consent. 4.1, the yard management solution, and 4.2, the Auditor General's report.
Okay. And would we be able to discuss those at today's meeting?
I believe, yes, we can. Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So item 4.1 and 4.2 will be pulled from consent. And since they are pulled, we don't need to hear public comments at this time. We'll hear them when they come back on the agenda later in the meeting. So on that note, no public comment on consent, and we'll move on to item number 5. I'm sorry, do we have?
No, you hear 5.1, and then you come back to what you pulled off consent. Yeah.
Okay. Which is the regular agenda. We'll start with 5.1, which is to adopt a resolution authorizing the refunding in whole or in part of the 2000 Measure A sales tax revenue refunding bonds and 2008 Series A, B, C, and D, and 2000 Measure A sales tax revenue bonds, 2010 Series A, and termination of interest rate swaps related to the 2008 bonds, approving the form of the transaction documents, and authorizing the GM/CEO and the Deputy GM/CFO to individually take all actions necessary to issue the 2000 Measure A sales tax revenue refunding bonds in one or more series and pay issuance costs. The full staff recommendation is noted on the screen. I also want to note that the transaction documents are on file in the board office, and Greg Richardson, our Deputy GM/CFO, will provide a brief report to explain what all that means.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the rest of the board, good morning. With me today, Peter Ross, who is our financial advisor. He's sitting down there next to Jim. He's here to provide any responses to questions that might come up, and I believe Mike Smith could be on the line. So he will also be here to provide any comments. I'll go through the packet here and then turn it over for any questions. So as it's been identified, if we can go to the next slide, we are seeking to execute a transaction effectively to refund two different series of bonds, the 2008 and the 2010 bonds. With that, if economics work in our favor, we'll be able to, in refunding the 2008 bonds, we would also be terminating associated interest rate swaps, and we'll talk more about those as we move forward. And as we'll review a little bit later, the reasons for this is the bond market has created an opportunity for us to execute these refunds that is not normally available to us. And one side note also is a refunding transaction will only happen if these market conditions stay or continue to generate a favorable outcome for us. On the next slide, just wanted to give everyone a view as to what our current portfolio of bonds are. So two different major series, the 2000 Measure A sales tax with 4 different series of outstanding bonds, and then the 1976 revenue bonds as well. The two that are highlighted in blue, the 2008 and 2010, are the bonds that we'll be discussing today. So on the next slide, we start talking a little bit about each of the individual series. So the 2008 bonds we affectionately call the swaps. Back in 2008, they were issued utilizing variable interest rates that basically reset on a weekly or daily basis. In an effort to sort of protect against that variability, we entered into a swap arrangement, effectively creating a synthetic fixed rate that we paid for. And in that process, we had about a 3.7, 3.8% fixed rate that we were guaranteed as we move forward. The idea was that we would have monies returned to us through an investment vehicle that was basically going to match the variable rates that we were paying to the bondholders, so effectively creating that synthetic rate. A refunding now with these 2008 bonds would necessitate that termination of the rate swaps, which has always historically created the issue with us in being able to refund these, because the cost to do that is relatively high. But in today's market, higher taxable interest rates allow for that termination cost to be reduced, which is really a key for us as we're having these conversations. So as you go to the next slide, we talk about the 2010 bonds. These are what we refer to as the BABs, the Build America bonds. They were issued under the provisions of the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Basic premise here is when we issued these bonds, they were issued as taxable bonds. Normally, we don't issue taxable bonds, and they have a higher rate associated with them. But as a part of that, the federal government was providing a subsidy initially of 35%, which effectively reduced our overall cost associated with these bonds. So our net interest cost as a result of that, when it was initially done, was about a 3.8% number. Over the last several years, sequestration efforts have been continued discussed within the federal budget process. And so early on, that subsidy was reduced from 35% to 33%, and some of those conversations actually were going on this past budget cycle when the reauthorization process was going on, to conversations of actually eliminating the subsidy or reducing it considerably. And again, the market conditions, a higher taxable interest rate environment actually makes the redemption price that we would be paying for these to get out of these particular bonds a little bit more beneficial today than they would have been in the past. So on the next slide, we talk about kind of the risks for both of these. So on the 2008 bonds, you know, the risk that's inherent right now, or that's in front of us, is really the change that's occurred to the index that we use to identify kind of the match to the variable rate that we pay to the bondholders. The LIBOR, which has been a historical index used for many, many years, has been eliminated from this process, and now we're going to what's called SOFR. It's not necessarily an exact match to what LIBOR was, and so in that, it creates a little bit of risk in this process. Inherently, though, within variable rate debt and the whole swap environment, there's always a feeling of risk that exists within that. And if there's an opportunity for us to get out of that at basically little to no cost, then there's some benefit to us having that discussion, which is why we're presenting it to the group today. On the 2010 bonds, really the major risk for us right now is that future of the subsidy. And so if that subsidy were to go away, you've effectively increased, and as it would stand today, the debt service for us would move up $30 million, just simply eliminating that subsidy. And so that risk exists, and we're trying to mitigate that risk as best we can. And again, given the current market, that opportunity is presenting itself. So on the next slide, we talk a little bit about the opportunity, and I've referenced it a little bit, that to refinance both the 2008 and the 2010, what you need is two different situations occurring that historically don't always happen. One, you need taxable interest rates to be higher, and you need tax-exempt rates to be lower. And that's been happening over the last, call it 6 to 8 months. Over the past 10 years, as we've talked about it here, that relationship between the tax exempt and the taxable stays about a 90% difference. One is, the taxable is about a 90% difference versus the tax exempt. In today's market, that tax exempt rate is now more favorable at about a 68, 69% number. And because of that, it's created this opportunity for us to possibly refund these bonds. On the next slide, and yes, very busy slide. Love to dissect the entire graph for you and love to do it. However, all I really want you to focus on is to the far right. You've got the red and the blue lines that are traveling to the right. On the red is basically matching your taxable rate, and the blue is effectively matching your tax exempt rate. And what you're seeing is historically, the relationship has stayed pretty tight, and that's what you would expect, that just over time they would stay pretty close in proximity to each other. But in this past year, that divergence has opened up considerably. And because of that, it's created this opportunity for us to get into this particular refund. And so we want to be able to take advantage of that scenario should it continue over the next couple of months. So on the next slide, we talk about what this opportunity could mean. So in June of 2022, when the tax exempt rates were about 82% of taxable rates, still better than what they historically would have been, if we had done a transaction in June of 2022, we would have had what is referred to net present value savings of about $8.5 million related to the 2008 bonds. And on the BABs, it would have been about a $3.5 million savings. Doesn't mean we would have had to come up with $12 million at closing. It just means that the overall cost of the debt service associated with those bonds would have increased to the point the net present value of that would have been a savings to us. And effectively, you wouldn't do that transaction. In June of 2023, the way the market has changed, we have an opportunity to actually do a refunding that would be a savings on the 2008 bonds individually, but when you combine it with the net present value savings on the BABs, you actually come out as a combined transaction of a net present value savings. And again, given the risks that exist in both of these particular series, being able to get out of this at least a break even is something that we would like to be able to consider. And so the next steps that you would see happening here is, as the normal transaction would go on, we assume that we're going to be moving forward with something, so we keep the momentum moving forward. We'll have credit presentations that we'll provide to Moody's and S&P next week. At that time, assuming we believe that the market will continue in its current path, we'll receive ratings in early July from both rating agencies. And again, if market conditions are favorable for us, then on July 17th, 18th, we would anticipate pricing the bonds and then ultimately closing them in August, again, assuming the pricing occurred on that July 17, 18 timeframe. So with that, I think we are finished on that piece of it, and we'll open it for questions, if by some chance there are any.
Director Lee, for you.
Thank you. I study engineering and I'm a lawyer, so all this finance stuff is still kind of Greek to me, so I just apologize if I have some dumb questions here. My basic understanding is that when interest rate goes up, the value of bond goes down. Mm-hmm. And that's why we have the failure of SVB and First Republic. Right, with the delta. And so what I'm trying to understand what we're doing here is we have some old bonds that was issued, mm-hmm. and now what we're saying, when we say refund, we basically are buying them back.
Correct.
Right, so when we buy a bond back,
yeah.
Right, so the interest rate, of course, is a lot higher now than it used to be, I assume. Is that the reason? Because now that the interest rate's higher, that means the bond are worth less, and we're buying at a lower price, or no? Actually,
A little bit different than that. So if you think about the bonds that we have in place right now, if you think about the fixed rate, the effective yield that we're paying for those particular bonds is in that 3.7, 3.8, 3.9 range. We're actually in an environment where we have the ability to go out on a tax-exempt basis. And through the issuance of these bonds and the premiums that we anticipate receiving, that we actually would get an effective yield that is lower than what we're currently paying. So what we're able to do is, one, get out of the swaps themselves, get out of the BABs themselves with any sort of redemption prices necessary, and even with that additional cost, given the interest rate, the effective rate that we're anticipating to be paying going forward, we're actually going to be better off going forward with our debt service. So that's the concept.
So instead of the 3.8 that we would have been paying, we'll go down to what, 3 or 2?
Yeah, I think we're looking. I should have it in front of me right now.
It's about 2.9%.
That's what, yeah, a little less than 3.
Okay, so that's really what we're
Yeah,
dealing
that's-
with, trying to get from 3.8 to lower.
Right, with an understanding that, I want to emphasize this point. Historically, wouldn't be able to do that because the cost to get out of these bonds would be so much, your incremental or your effective rate would actually go up.
Right.
We're in a position right now where, because of the market conditions, we have the ability to get out of these things and still reduce the overall debt service. That's really what we're trying to achieve in the aggregate.
Pay less. Thank you. I get that.
Okay, well, do we have any public comment on this? And then
I
we'll
had a
return to-
question as well.
Okay, let's go to public comment first, and then we'll, I should have done that previously. Okay. All right, so let's see, Director Foley?
Thank you. Effectively, what we're doing is refinancing these bonds to lower their interest rates. That's how coming from the mortgage world where borrowers refinance all the time, we're really, the terminology is refunding, but effectively we're refinancing. That's how I think about it in my simplified head.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell me what you had said at very minimal cost, but I know there's someone handling this sale. Do they get a brokerage fee, a commission? What kind of fees are involved in this sale or in this refunding?
Yeah. Peter, do you have?
There are several types of fees. We pay fees for the rating agencies, for example, to rate the bonds. But in terms of what you would call the brokerage fee, the underwriting fee for the investment banks who would be taking these bonds and marketing them, it runs what they refer to as $1.25 per bond per thousand, so which is very low. I think the overall, so you call it 1% times roughly 500 million of bonds. That's around 500,000 in total fees to market the bonds.
Are we increasing the amount of the bond to cover the fees? How are the fees being paid for?
They're being paid from bond proceeds. So yes, it's sort of a complicated math formula because you add in certain costs, the cost of terminating the swaps, the cost of the bond redemption, and then the other thing is that these bonds are sold at a premium, so you're getting more bond proceeds than the par. But the bottom line is that all the costs of the transaction are funded with the bonds, and any kind of savings or dissavings, the numbers that you see on the screen, are inclusive of all the transaction costs.
Right.
So, in plain language,
Okay.
are we increasing the amount of the bonds to cover the fees? Using my analogy of
Yes,
a mortgage and
If you
refinancing.
didn't have to pay the fees, there would be a slightly lower amount of the bond. So yes, the bond amount increases incrementally to cover the
Okay.
cost of the transaction.
I just wanted to be clear
Okay.
about that. Thank you very much.
And Director Lopez?
Thanks so much. Greg, my question is, why are we seeing suddenly such a wide disparity in the LIBOR swap rate and the MMD? And, do you realistically expect that to continue relatively, about a percentage point, but compared to historical performance?
I would love to be able to answer that question with confidence. I think it's just, to me, the market conditions that exist, and whether it's conditions with the Fed fund rate and what they're moving. Again, there's usually not a direct correlation, but the impact that it has on the market could be driving some of these particular issuances, both tax and tax exempt. To me, it's an anomaly. I think there's an expectation that that gap will slowly get back to a more realistic 90% sort of ratio, which is also why we want to be able to move in this environment before that closure sort of comes back.
Yeah. And looking at this timeline here on the last slide, we basically need, if I'm reading correctly, those conditions to persist for about a month or so for
Yes.
us to be able to go through. Okay.
Yeah. And just so everyone understands, and I want to make sure this is clear, and that's the reason why we're bringing it today, just given the blackout period, if I could call it that way, with board action between now and August, because of how quickly the markets can change, we want to be able to be in that position to move, in some cases even quicker. If the conditions don't exist on the 17th and 18th, but they change back in our favor in 2 more weeks, being able to move gives us that flexibility.
Yeah. And assuming they don't persist, we just won't close on the deal.
Correct.
Yeah.
If they don't persist, the one option that we still may pursue is only doing one, and that would be the BABs, because even those could potentially still be in the money, and they then effectively reduce what I would consider to be the most urgent risk, potentially, just simply because we don't know what the federal government's going to do from a budgetary perspective. And so that can always be taken away. And so if we can get out of those at a net present value savings of at least break even or better, and ideally that to me would be a positive NPV. If we can do that, then that transaction we may still go forward with.
Yeah. And if we don't go forward, do you still have some of those costs that Director Foley was just asking about associated with the transaction?
The only cost that would potentially still be have to be borne by us without those bond proceeds would be rating agency dollars.
Okay.
And so that's what we've got, about a 6-month horizon, I think, maybe a little bit shorter. It could be anywhere from 90 to 180 days to where their ratings would be valid. And so that's the only real risk that exists from the cost side.
I would throw bond counsel fees in there as well.
Okay.
And are we confident that we'll get a positive rating?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, great. Well, I'll just say, I really appreciate the attention to detail and letting us be able to potentially take advantage of the opportunity.
Thank you. Director Montano.
Thank you, Chair Burt. Just a couple of questions. So what's the original life of the bond?
You have that?
The bonds go out to 2036.
Yeah.
Okay, so will we be penalized if we, I guess my concern is the penalty cost. Is there a penalty for renewing these bonds or refunding these new bonds?
Well, for the BABs, we need to pay a redemption premium, which is a formula. And then with respect to the swaps, you can call it a penalty. We have to break the swap transaction. So those are all costs that are embedded in the analysis that you see up on the screen.
And was it going to be fixed or a variable?
These will all be traditional fixed-rate bonds.
Fixed rates, okay. And I guess the bottom line is, will we be paying more in the long run since it's going to be extended?
Well, the bonds will not be extended. We're keeping the maturity the same.
Okay.
And based on the current market conditions, when you look at the totality of the transactions, you'd be paying a little bit less than what you are right now without any of the attendant risks.
Right.
Okay. And then, so if we don't move with your recommendation, what are the ramifications?
It's really status quo. With respect to the BABs, you could be continuing at the existing interest rates, subject to the whims of the federal government come 2024. And then with respect to the swaps, it's really a function of what happens when this LIBOR rate transitions out come the end of this month and SOFR, and then as the markets adjust in general, the rates would be pretty much the same as what you have right now. Maybe a little, maybe higher with the SOFR transition.
Okay, and it'll cost us more in the long run.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And if I could just add to that, I think what you'll find in the market for a lot of folks, getting out of either one of these transactions for most agencies is actually a savings, but they're still willing to move forward with them to get out of that riskiness of what exists. It's, us having the opportunity to possibly get out of both of them with actually a savings is something to take advantage of.
Okay. Yes, Director Mann.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, I think Director Lopez already confirmed this, but I just want to ask again in very simple terms because this is complex. What is in the worst case scenario, what is our maximum downside risk here? As I understood it, there's no point over the course of this transaction where we are obligated to move forward with something if conditions change and it becomes a disadvantageous move for VTA. Is that correct?
Yeah. I would say that the absolute downside would be we do not move forward with this transaction. And as a result of that, we would then incur costs associated with the rating agencies and I guess the bond counsel. And that dollar amount, depending on the transaction, I'm not sure of the bond counsel number, but
rating agency fees are about $150,000 for a transaction of this size.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of the downside, ultimately, if the federal government decides to end the subsidy, that's something that's clearly quantifiable. That's about a $30 million hit.
Right. Yeah, and I had a question on that. No, there's clearly more risk to the status quo. I think there's an obvious reason to do this. I just want to make sure we're doing our diligence and just understanding what the worst case scenario is. I just want to make sure we have a dollar value on that. It sounds like it's on the order of hundreds of thousands, not millions, which is good. And there's real upside if the conditions remain as they are. So I think we got that. On the 30 million, is that over the life of the bond, or is that an annual? I assume that's over the life of the bond.
That would be over the life of the bonds. So, again, as the slide showed that Greg had presented, the way the BABs work is that VTA pays a taxable rate. The Treasury reimburses it originally at 35%, now at 33%. So if that subsidy goes away, we'd be at that high taxable rate of the 5.875% without subsidy. So that's how we get the 30 million present value hit is really the removal of that subsidy over the remaining term of the bonds.
Understood.
Yep.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I just wanted to double check that there isn't a moment at which we're proceeding and have signed up to for some. We've entered into some obligation, and then market conditions change, and somehow we have to follow through on something that puts us in an even worse position. But again, I'm oversimplifying. Sounds like that is not the case. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Director Abikoga.
Thank you. I appreciate the chart. I'm a visual learner. So my question is, the gap you described that gives us this opportunity. Does that have to continue to keep the favorable conditions, or what happens? Because looking at the 10-year span, it seems like it's really, number one, unusual, and it might be a very short period of time. Does that matter, or is it just the point of entry that we're concerned
No,
about?
I mean, that is why we wanted to come to the body now and be able to take advantage of it as quickly as possible. How long that gap will exist, hard to say. I think as the graph shows, there was a point in time where it was actually, I think the spread was better than the 68, 69% that we're talking about today. And so it is possible that it continues to close. And as long as we can stay close to what we see today, we'll move forward. But if it closes close to where it's been historically, then the transaction won't be worth it.
And then if we enter, but then it closes?
Not
then
an
it-
issue.
it does- Okay,
Not an
great.
issue.
And then it looks like with BABs, regardless, we should be looking at other options because of the losses of the, is that right?
Yeah, and again, if the market stays close to what it is today, or even closes a little bit, that one is not as cost prohibitive to do a refinancing as the
So that
swaps would be.
30%,
Yeah,
the
and so if we
subsidy.
can still make that one happen and hold on to the swap bonds, then we'll do that. But we definitely are looking at the BABs as at least one of the transactions.
Great, thank you.
Okay. If we don't have any other questions or comments? No?
I was just going to make a motion to approve.
Exactly.
Second,
That's what I was looking for.
Chavez.
Thank you. Motion by Director Jimenez, second by Vice Chair Chavez. Seeing no further discussion, would the clerk please call the roll?
Blankley is not yet on the Zoom, but I believe her alternate member Turner is here. Is that correct? Yes. All right. So would you?
Member Turner, would you like to join us?
Please.
Oh, we need one more chair.
I'll come back to you, alternate member Turner. I'll go with, if you can come up, please. All right, I'll go with Davis first. Davis?
Yes.
Foley?
Yes.
Dean is absent, so I'll call on Montano.
SROs.
It's okay. Montano?
Yes.
Thank you. Jane?
Yes.
Jimenez?
Yes.
Lee?
Aye.
Lopez?
Aye.
Mahan?
Aye.
Torres?
Aye.
Chavez?
Yes.
Burt?
Thank you.
Yes.
Turner?
Abstain?
Okay, thank you. Motion passed, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, so that concludes 5.1. Our next item is 5.2, which is an update on the VTA's BART Silicon Valley Phase 2, including the Business Resource Program. Gary Griggs, Chief BART Silicon Valley Program Officer, will provide the report. Welcome.
Yes, Chair Burt, Vice Chair Chavez, and Assistant General Manager Richardson, and directors. My name is Gary Griggs. I'm the Program Officer for VTA, overseeing the BART Silicon Valley Phase 2 extension. I'm joined here with a colleague, Clarence Ng, who will be speaking to the program resource, to our business resource program as part of our presentation. How do we do this? Our agenda, I'll give a brief update on the Silicon Valley Phase 2 project, and then, as I mentioned, Clarence Ng will speak to the Business Resource Program. So, how does it work? In terms of the update, we are in the process of completing the preliminary engineering, which will be part of our FTA New Starts application submittal coming up in the next couple of months. We have obtained some approvals from the City of San Jose and the City of Santa Clara for our construction transportation management plan, which is very good news, which is precedent to proceeding with work on the West Portal and the new Har Yard facility, so one of our early works programs. We are working closely in coordination with BART, addressing design issues, and they're involved in submittal reviews as well. We had a couple of events that I wanted to make note of. One was MTC at MTC headquarters had organized an Owners' Night event, which was sponsored by the Construction Management Association of America, the ACEC, American Consulting Engineers, and Build Out California. And that was an opportunity where owners like VTA and others came to that event and were able to meet industry of participants who are interested in working on our programs, with a particular focus on small business and disadvantaged business. We also had a very significant event last Friday that was organized by Vice Chair Chavez, where we invited the MTC to come and visit the BART Silicon Valley project, and had a number of the directors there as well. Chair Burt was there, and Abikoga was there, and Chair Davis. So it was a very good event. It gave us an opportunity to show the MTC what we're doing with our project, and also to show them the development that's ongoing here in Silicon Valley and the potential future development that will be forthcoming from having a project like the BART project and transit-oriented development that's associated with it. Next slide. Can never get this thing. Are you going to do it for me? Thank you. Wanted to talk about the current construction contract that we have underway, our construction package 2, which is for tunnel and track work. As I mentioned before, this is a progressive design build project, so we're working together with the contractor team in the early phase of the project to come up with improvements to the project and moving forward. I think you're aware, and we reported on the innovations that were forthcoming from that exercise. They are the KST team, the Kiewit Shea Trailer team, are advancing the design and also doing cost estimating related to the early work packages and the program overall. We're in the professional services phase of that contract, and we have received the preliminary engineering submittal from the KST team, which is part of our FTA New Start submittal. We do have ongoing discussions currently with the contractor in regard to the estimated cost and schedule of the project. As I mentioned before, with a progressive design build project, we do not have a guaranteed maximum price, so we have to negotiate that going forward. And we are conducting constructability reviews as well. We're going to have a review with construction professionals coming in to review the approach that our contractor is proposing in executing that portion of the work. Next slide, please. I want to give you a quick update on the FTA, Federal Transit Administration, work that we're doing. We have ongoing monthly meetings with both FTA headquarters and FTA Region 9 here locally, and also with the program management oversight consultant that works for FTA in oversight and review of the work that we're doing. We're also conducting regular risk review meetings, and we have FTA participating in those meetings with us. And we want to do that to prepare for the upcoming entry into New Starts Engineering when we submit, and they will be undertaking a risk assessment. So we want to make sure that we can align with them as we move forward for that risk assessment. We recently transmitted 39 management plans, project management, quality management, requirements management, a list of plans that are required by the Federal Transit Administration. We actually did that in advance of our formal submittal so that we could expedite that review with the Federal Transit Administration. And then we will be going, as I mentioned, requesting entry into the New Starts Engineering program here in the next few months. Next slide, please. Wanted to talk a little bit, and I've been discussing it with you for some time, that we are in the process of preparing our new baseline costs and schedule, which will go in as part of the FTA submittal. We're also updating our project risk register and working again closely with the Federal Transit Administration on that. We do continue to have serious concerns about market conditions, and I've spoken to you about that in terms of escalation, that we're seeing increased interest rates of supply and resource issues, and lack of competition, other factors that we're concerned about. We're monitoring what's going on around the country with other projects, and it is something that we're trying to mitigate as best we can, but do have a concern. We're also, to try to mitigate that, and have been, and I've reported to you before, assessing contract packaging and the timing of those additional elements of the program to help to mitigate that, looking at different construction approaches. And we are doing a very formal value engineering exercise to help us work through this. And then finally, I wanted to mention that we are doing a totally independent cost estimate for the program. So that'll give us another check on not only our own estimates, but what an independent party will be saying about those as well. And we've been benchmarking against other projects to see how we compare to them. Next slide, please. Once we get that new baseline costs and schedule pinned down, I want to give you more detailed reports that you requested on the status of our program, both financially and schedule-wise. But I did want to give you a summary cost and schedule report today, as this came up in our previous board meeting. So in terms of the schedule, you can see that in the 5-year look-ahead schedule, you can see that we're in the engineering procurement phase and also into the early work construction phase. And we have a couple of critical time deadlines there, milestones. One is the entry into New Starts engineering, as I've been discussing. And then about a year down the road, we will be pursuing a full funding grant agreement with Federal Transit Administration. So this is a critical time where we will get approval from the Federal Transit Administration of the federal component of our project. I also wanted to give you a snapshot of where we are in terms of expenditures to date. I'm sorry, that doesn't, probably a little hard to read there, hopefully you can see, but you'll see that there are 10 categories that the Federal Transit Administration identifies that we track our costs against. We're early in the program, so right now we're only involved in 3 of those categories, as I've shown here. One is the site and special conditions. The other one is right-of-way, which we've seen a lot of activity in. And then the one where we've had the most activity is in the professional services area as we progress the project to this phase during the planning, environmental, and design. So that gives you an idea of the expenditures to date, at least through May, coming from when we started in March of 2016. So, and I can assure you that those are all well within budget, and when we get the new budget set out, I'll give you a more detailed report. We're managing these expenditures very closely and track costs on a monthly basis, so I want to give you assurance that we are monitoring and managing these expenditures very closely. So now I'd like to move on to the next part of our presentation and turn it over to my colleague Clarence Ng to talk about the Business Resource Program. I do want to emphasize that this program is specific to small businesses that will be directly affected by the construction. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Ng.
Good morning, Board. Again, my name is Clarence Ng. I'm with the Bart Silicon Valley Phase 2 External Affairs team. Also, I think online is Bernice and Lenise, who is available in case there are any additional questions. What we are here today is to talk about is really the Business Resource Program. That is part of VTA's commitment, environmental commitments for the BSV2 project. Specifically, we're really trying to, as we are being proactive in advance of construction, looking at and evaluating potential disruptions to, in particular, small businesses. So what we are doing is that, again, being proactive in advance of construction, we've developed a series of strategies so that we can put them in place so that when construction does occur, that we have, again, additional support. You'll hear through the presentation how we're going to be enabling better business visibility and also access during the construction, again, being very sensitive to these small businesses. Next slide, please. So if you jump into it, really where I wanted to start off first is that, again, we've been very proactive in thinking through and working with the contractor and having additional requirements. So again, unlike some other experiences in the past, we are really trying to focus and make sure that those measures are in place. And I think you may have heard that there was the construction CTMP, Construction Transportation Management Plan, that's been prepared. So this is, again, one additional element. So the BRP, as I'll use as a short version, is really, again, focused on small businesses. You'll get a little bit more of a description as we go through and better understand it, but really what we're trying to do is that it's a strategy that we can help put in place in advance of construction, during construction, and be adaptive to their specific needs. Small business, as we're defining it for this program, are businesses that are less than 35 employees, have a business license in either the city of San Jose or Santa Clara. And again, we're trying to focus on the small. It's really, if you imagine, more the mom and pop businesses that are more susceptible, that have lower thresholds, right? They're more susceptible to disruptions, as we've seen through COVID. So part of that is understanding that foot traffic and their livelihood is really dependent on it. So we're not talking about, someone who's drop shipping, in a building. Those lower margins are important because with changing economic conditions, again, they are those that we want to be able to protect through this construction. We've worked tirelessly over the last few years. We've had engaged the VTA's BSV Small Business Task Force. We had at least had 5 meetings, including a recent presentation earlier last month where we presented some of the same information you're seeing. So we've incorporated some of that feedback, and you'll see some of that later on. We've worked with community working groups. We've evaluated and did research and spoke to other agencies around the country, including LA Metro and Valley Metro in Phoenix. So again, there's a lot of information that has been incorporated into this program. Next slide, please. So there are 4 main elements in the program. Signage wayfinding is something that I think you all can appreciate, where during the construction, there will be some changes in lanes, maybe parking restrictions, maybe sidewalk closures. That is really helping increase the visibility, showing that the businesses are open, that we'll have street banners, we'll have integrated signs at bus shelters, additional signage that helps people navigate through the entire area. The second element, which is in part and parcel of the signage wayfinding, is the shop local marketing. What that is that it's a branded marketing campaign to really, the entire BSV corridor, identify it as a place, if you wish. The construction will be located, again, above ground, more visible above ground, obviously apart from tunneling, throughout the corridor, and it will progress over the corridor. So this is really an overall campaign that really ties the whole corridor together. What that does is that it creates a sense of place. We'll be able to have signage and wayfinding. We'll have a series of elements, including social media, a web page on the BSV's main site that will be able to, again, provide this information. Again, marketing materials, a logo, you'll see that in the next slide, that really helps to be able to tie that together, and they can incorporate it as part of their marketing materials, and they can leverage some of ours as well. The third component, I'm going to go back to the previous slide, please. Third component is the small business resource, connections and support. That is really providing helping those businesses become resilient, right, through the process. I'll walk through, and maybe the next slide you'll see a little bit more, that really enables them to leverage some of the existing resources from the community, some that VTA will offer, and really bring the community together, connect businesses with these providers. The fourth element is the direct financial assistance. That's probably what's generated most interest that we've had over the last while developing it, and I'll get into that a little bit more into detail. It's about a $2 million overall annual grant with, again, I'll maybe wait for the next slides to get into those details, but that is a component that would begin after construction begins. So the first 3, we're planning to have that in place in advance of construction. Next slide, please. So here are some graphics of describing what those 4 elements are. Signage and wayfinding on the top left. Again, sign where there's a logo. It says that businesses are open and identifies where they're located. Window clings and the like. Shop local marketing. There's a branded logo, as you see. We've come up with the Each Shop Local, where, again, really be able to focus on the small businesses. Again, bottom right, you see some training opportunities and some online experience. And I just want to highlight on direct financial assistance in LA Metro, what they did was they actually, as part of the website, they spotlit some of these businesses. And so again, provides a little bit of that direct connection. One thing I want to say about this entire program, it's opt-in. So it's not mandatory, but we're encouraging businesses and looking forward to their participation. Next slide. So again, where we generated most of the conversations is the direct financial assistance. Why are we looking at that? Because again, a lot of the small businesses who, again, have very low margins, oftentimes some of that disruptions really affects them. So again, what we've identified is about a $2 million annual direct grant. There are criteria, so it's not just handing free money. There is actual criteria that we've developed, and we're in the process of working with legal and others to kind of refine. But what we really did here, work in the business task force, was these small businesses really need the money really quickly. So we've actually developed a 3-tier kind of process where the first initial dollars, which are lower, have lesser requirements. So yes, we have to have an attestation of a direct disruption. You have to be located within, let's say, 500 feet of the actual above-ground construction, and that you've experienced at the minimum of 2 weeks of actual continuous disruption. And that's important because, again, it allows us to have criteria that we can use to manage these allocation of these funds, and there is proof of loss of we're in the up to the 10,000 per year. When we get to the upper tier, that's when we're going to start requiring a little bit more documentation in terms of that. And to give you a sense of kind of where we are, as we've defined it so far, it's $1,000 for at the minimum of 2 weeks of continuous disruption, 3,000, sort of it becomes cumulative, 3,000 for greater than 3 months, and up to 10,000 for greater than 6 months. So again, if you go for 1,000 or 3,000, you can only get the remainder for the $10,000. Again, we've based that in part on the research and of other programs that we've evaluated. And so, for instance, LA Metro has their program in place since 2014, as well as Valley Metro is in, I think, 2021 as they did there. So a lot of history behind kind of what we've developed. I think next slide, please. So I'm kind of wrapping up the presentation. An important component of this BRP program is it's not, we're not just going to wait for folks to have disruptions and then come to us. We're going to have a business liaison team who's going to be on the ground, multilingual, building relationships with the community before construction so that we really understand, their concerns, be a conduit between them, the BSV team, as well as the construction team, right? So it may not only be related to, some of the disruptions, but maybe some of the interactions that they have, and so we'll be able to use that as feedback. They'll be based out of the project teams, and the key is that they'll be on the ground, right? Really be able to interact with the community and build those relationships through that process. I'll wrap up with the next slide, which really what that does is that it gives you a quick timeline of construction is obviously not starting at least till next year. So we're looking at wrapping up the plan, let's say, end of this summer, and be able to roll that out, thereafter in advance of construction. Again, an important part is being able to be proactive. There are elements in this that we can be a little bit more flexible and we'll be nimble in terms of be able to adjust as needed. But that is, again, probably a quick summary of where we are today. And I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. So before hearing from members of the public, I know on your particular item, we have a couple questions. So first, Director Jimenez.
Thank you. So I have a few questions, some about the money and some about just what you've learned from some of the other folks or other agencies such in LA that you've learned. But my first question is related to, and I'm not sure who to direct this question to, but obviously with the approach we're taking, I think fundamentally at its very core is we're trying to make sure these businesses survive and thrive during construction. But can someone chime in on sort of what the philosophy is that VTA is taking as it relates to that? I mean, does that make sense? Like, is our goal to make sure that these businesses survive? Is it? I mean, how are we sort of framing our approach to making sure that the construction that we're doing, sort of how that relates to the businesses and how we sort of the end product, if you will, right? What is it that we're trying to do?
Sure. I will say, and again, this is just being very straightforward, is we are not anticipating that with the direct financial assistance in particular, that we're going to help a business survive if they weren't viable and not be able to survive on their own, period, right? The goal is that these dollars are to help them through a disruption. If you look at any other public works project, there are disruptions. There are lane closures, there are parking removal, and there's no compensation for that. But we understand through, and to be honest, I mean, Alum Rock was a little bit of, that's on the top of our mind in terms of being able to respond. The construction is very different from this project than Alum Rock, right? That one opened up the whole corridor for a long period of time. As I mentioned earlier, through the contracts with the contractor, all those measures are in place, and they're really focused in 4 major construction areas behind fences. So we are trying to, again, provide some additional support to businesses so that they can, again, the key focus is on the small businesses who may be more susceptible. So again, I hope that sort of answers.
I guess just based on what you're saying, effectively what you're saying is, my takeaway is that we're helping them weather the storm, if you will.
Correct.
Right, to businesses that would otherwise, be surviving and thriving. And so, you cited examples of like LA and other places, but are there lessons, can you talk a little bit about lessons learned as it relates to what they did and what we're going to do differently, or are we sort of modeling it exactly as to what they're doing or what they did?
We extrapolated a lot of the, I would say, lessons learned, good and bad type of thing. And their program, to be honest, was bigger, in part because the construction scale was bigger. Their dollar amounts were greater, but then they had greater, I'll use the word restrictions, where based on the input from the Small Business Task Force, we already decreased from a month minimum to 2 weeks, where LA Metro had 6 months. So if anything between 0 and 6 months, you don't receive any funds. So we've actually sort of, again, based on the scale and looking at our small business, looking at our community, we've really tried to tailor it. So there's a little bit of a mix and match, but again, Valley Metro and LA Metro were sort of a little bit different. So we tried to, I would say, pick the best parts of it. I think through administration also is some things that we learned, and we've spoken to, as part of the Alum Rock as well, that process, we've learned from that as well. So it's a little bit of mix and match.
Right, I appreciate that. And then just a question about slide 10 and 11. So on slide 10, that's the top line, that's where it has the photo of the Fuji restaurant on the right. So you see the amount there in the first bullet point, 3 million annual program budget. And then on slide 11, it talks about 2 million annual grant budget. I'm trying to understand, is that, are we talking about the same bucket there? Is it?
Remember, there are 4 elements, of which $3 million is the overall annual for all 4 elements. So there is some of the direct costs for signage and things like that.
Okay.
And then where the majority of the $2 million with some additional administration goes to the direct financial assistance.
Okay, and can you talk a little bit about how it was determined that that was sufficient to because $10,000 doesn't sound like a whole lot, but, and I know obviously there's a lot of businesses, we need to spread that out and such,
Right.
but how it was determined, sort of the analysis done, as it relates to determining that 2 million is going to be sufficient to actually help sustain the businesses?
So the $10,000 in part was, again, looking at other agencies. LA Metro had a larger amount, but bigger budget. When we looked, and again, this is an estimate, not cast in stone, but there's approximately about 450 businesses within those areas that we've defined, 500 feet, forestation areas. We believe there's about 200 eligible businesses within those areas, and $10,000, 200 businesses, about $2 million. The reality is probably not every business is going to apply, but again, that's kind of where we ended up with the number. And
Okay.
it's subject to the board. I mean, the board, as in the past, in other agencies, those dollar amounts can vary at your discretion.
Okay, all right. And I have a few other questions, but I'll stop asking questions. I suspect there's other questions. But let me just end with, I had a friend that owned a store when VTA Light Rail was coming in on First Street. He's since passed, but his business went under. That was the sort of the initiation of the San Jose Downtown Association, things of that nature. Obviously, the bus rapid transit, very familiar with how that impacted the neighborhood. And so we've seen this before, this type of disruption before, and so my hope is that as we go down this road, that we implement those lessons learned. Some of this stuff that you mentioned, I mean, I appreciate the work. It sounds very similar to what we've seen. Maybe there are some differences. I wasn't following some of these other things very closely, but I do truly hope that that what we're implementing really has an impactful sort of that impacts the businesses in a positive way, and I hope we don't see businesses go under as we have in the past, or as much as we have in the past. So, just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may, Member Jimenez, I think you're right on target with that. And when you referred to lessons learned, we clearly learned from the Alum Rock experience, as well as, and this is even before my time, you know how long ago that is, the North First Street experience was. So we're being proactive. We're doing this in advance. I think what we wound up at the end with Alum Rock was a reasonable accommodation, but it could have been much better if we'd been prepared in advance. And I think you've heard from Clarence and from Gary that we are being as proactive as possible. And I have to tell you the other dynamic that Clarence did mention. You can't save every business. What we can do is minimize the impact that this construction has. And this board, as you know, wisely chose to do a single bore to avoid the major disruption that is taking place in LA and San Francisco and other places. So thank you for your comments, and I think the overall answer is we've learned our lesson, and lessons have been learned.
Thank you.
Given that we have multiple directors who have both questions and comments, if it's okay, I'd like to go to members of the public, and then we'll go to the additional discussion and questions. So do we have members of the public who wish to speak?
We do have one member with their hand raised on Zoom. Eugene, please accept the unmute and begin speaking when ready.
Good morning, board members and staff. This is Eugene Bradley, Silicon Valley Transit users. I do commend the presentation that was just made. It seems VTA has learned some of the lessons from Alum Rock and even the project to build the original transit mall for the city of San Jose about maintaining input from smaller businesses and making sure they're informed of construction. So this is to be commended. So keep up the good work, please. Thank you.
And there are no more hands raised.
Thank you. So next, Director Torres.
Yeah, good morning. I think we're still in good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Director Jimenez, for some of those questions, because some of those questions were actually my questions, but that's quite okay. And I'm getting a little bit anxious here, because I actually worked at City Hall and dealt with some of the businesses when BRT came rolling down, and so that's this presentation obviously is getting me a little bit nervous, but you all had a wonderful presentation, and I know that we are going to learn our lessons about BRT and North First Street, because just to be brutally honest, there's a couple of businesses on East Santa Clara Street that were displaced when we originally had the light rail come in, and then they got almost displaced because of BRT, and now they're knocking on at City Hall's door saying like, here we go again. With that, I just have a couple questions, more in-depth questions about the shop local marketing and the leveraging existing resources. So I know that either San Jose Downtown Association or Latino Business Foundation or Prosperity Labs, these organizations that already have relationships with our small businesses, are we utilizing their assistance?
Yes, we have been coordinating, and that is part, I think, of the overall process. This is not intended to replace anybody, but really to try to create a little bit more cohesion, if you wish, and as this corridor will be under construction. And remember that the construction will progress through the corridor, so some of those businesses that we reach out to really early on are not going to see any effects until later on, but it still, again, sets up that framework so that when construction does begin, it encourages folks to come down to this area and who are maybe down this area to be able to frequent these businesses. And yes, we are working very closely with all the different organizations.
And closely, meaning there's like check-ins, meetings, how close are we talking about?
So as part of the overall outreach, external affairs, we have been working, I know with each of the station areas, there are various communications, various interactions. This, if you wish, is sort of an additional, I won't say a layer, but it sort of ties all these things together a little, one level up, if you wish.
Okay, great. And as for the shop local marketing, it's almost the same. I know we have some very, how can I put this? Some very active, I shouldn't say foodies, but like social media icons, stars in San Jose, right? Are we utilizing, I see here social media on websites, are we like contracting out to like, I know a lot of folks on here, they follow San Jose Fools or Bay Area Foodie or a bunch of other San Jose-based foodies or folks who support small businesses by going to those small businesses, and their business like surges and just becomes really popular and et cetera. So are we going to be utilizing folks like those?
You're asking a very sort of detailed question in my mind. So it's like, again, with the overall project, there is social media, and we are leveraging that. Again, the shop local marketing is really, lack of a better term, maybe a campaign, right? So that, I wouldn't want to see competition between like their initiatives, like, as individuals, but this is something where, as a program, shop local marketing becomes the brand, it's the campaign, and that people can tie into. So if there are events or there are, pop-ups or workshops and things like that, that's kind of where it ties together.
I think our Director of External Affairs, Bernice Alanese, would like to speak about that as well.
Yeah, hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry I'm not there physically, just had knee surgery, so can't drive, but this is a very, very important aspect of the BART program delivery. And I wanted to make two comments. Also, just wanted to make a comment about what Director Torres said about some of the local businesses. I went to the Adega Bakery this past weekend, and she said that she was so busy because of all the social media. So yes, we have a whole social media plan, and we are also working through the Small Business Task Force. We have identified like 35 community-based organizations to help with that technical assistance in marketing. So we will provide a resource list to all of the businesses that opt in to participate in the Small Business Resource Program. I also just wanted to really clarify that as part of the proactive effort for this, even before we developed the Small Business Resource Plan, we have been putting requirements into the contract specifications that make the community considerations a priority in project delivery. So whereas a contractor may typically have some flexibility in means and methods, they still have some flexibility, but we're putting in some constraints so that community considerations are considered in how the project is delivered. So that with the basis of Gary just mentioned with like the single bore tunneling, or Jim with the methodology of that to reduce impacts, and now the constraints that the contractors will have as far as the means and methods and how the project delivery along with this program will be a significantly different environment than we have executed project delivery in the past.
Great. No, thank you so much for this plan, and I know we're hoping to do this right. So because we gotta maintain a beautiful and strong downtown San Jose. So thank you,
Director Mann.
Thanks, Chair. Really appreciate my colleagues' comments and questions. I'll try to be quick because I think we covered a lot of ground here. First, I assume we are incorporating language accessibility into everything, especially in Spanish and Vietnamese, in terms of the outreach, the materials. Is that I'm seeing heads nod?
Yes, correct.
Okay, great. Also, it seems to me, maybe to a point Director Jimenez made, that there's a real big difference between having foot traffic disrupted for a few weeks or months versus having to actually relocate. Are we thinking differently about how to assist businesses who have to permanently relocate versus deal with the inconvenience of having less visibility or foot traffic for a few months. The 10,000 may help a lot with the latter case, but maybe a rounding error in the first case. So what's the thinking around relocation?
If I may, Director Mahan, that's a different program that we have that's run through real estate, and Ron Golem has been before you a couple of times to describe some of those activities. But you are absolutely correct. It's a lot more money, it's a lot more complex, and there are a lot of environmental, environmental regulations that apply in those cases. This is to deal with those that do not have to move.
Okay. And in the relocate, I know we're not talking about relocation in this update then, based on what you just said, but there are additional monies in that program for relocation. Okay. And then to what extent, I'm a big believer in learning from the customer and focusing on the customer. What have we heard from the businesses in terms of what they want? I mean, this program, on the surface at least, seems quite reasonable. I'm glad to see 2/3 of the money is going to direct transfers because I think they'll know how to use the dollars best to weather the storm, as was stated. But what have they told us they want in terms of assistance?
I will tell you that based on our experience at Alum Rock, one of the things we found was our requirements for proof were too rigorous and too burdensome for the organizations involved. So we've made significant changes and relying more on attestation than provable documentation for different periods of time. And again, the speed with which it's done is also an important factor. I think one of the things we found previously was we may have taken the review process may have been a little too long before checks were written and relief was granted, because as you know, small businesses are very heavily reliant on their cash flow issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those are just a couple.
Yeah, I appreciate those learnings. Have we reached out to and surveyed this set of businesses yet who are likely to be impacted, the 200 or so you mentioned?
Yes, so again.
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Great.
Hi, this is Bernice again. We did significant surveying and analysis pre-COVID, and then with COVID, we followed up and did further analysis. That's why we are presenting this program now. We were going to present it several months ago, but really wanted to get more input now that businesses are sort of returning. They're still struggling. But back to your former question, as far as what they're looking for, we received a significant amount of input on technical assistance, and that's why we're having those resources. Many of the small businesses creating a website, helping them learn how to communicate electronically and be able to market their businesses, raising their visibility so that their business is sure to be noticeable. That's why we're doing the signage and wayfinding program. And then having regular updates and having that liaison so they are fully informed of what the upcoming construction activities are. And we're also implementing a GIS-based active construction interactive map. So also just did a campaign so they can opt in for all the latest information. But the technical assistance and the visibility and the marketing were things that they really requested that they get support with.
Great, appreciate that insight as well. We also have a new downtown manager, and obviously our economic development team is very focused on the health of our small businesses across the city. Are you all coordinating? Are we finding ways to leverage each other's resources and reduce program administration costs?
Yes, they've been providing input on this program and also via the Small Business Task Force for the project specifically. So working closely with the Office of Economic Development at City of San Jose.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Well, I appreciate that we're being proactive and trying to incorporate as many learnings from past experience as possible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Director Turner.
Thank you, and I appreciate your efforts to assist small businesses. I was wondering, because the definition of small business varies depending on the agency. I think federal government is like 100 to 500 employees. State of California is less than 100. ACA was less than 50. How did, if I could ask, how did you arrive at the number of 35 employees?
Again, it was part of looking at other agencies and then also really trying to focus on the small mom and pop businesses. So that's kind of, and so we're also looking at probably right now and working with legal on it is a threshold of overall income, right? So trying to not be able to target those dollars where they really need to go.
Okay, so it really would come down to, there's two criteria, it sounds like, number of employees and revenue.
As well as location.
Location, okay, within that area of work.
Correct.
Yep, okay, very good, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Who's next? Sorry.
Thanks. Next is Director Lopez.
Thank you so much. I've got a specific question. How's the $10,000 arrived at as the maximum for direct assistance?
Again, it was based on just looking at other agencies. LA Metro had like $50,000, but then based on kind of targeting smaller businesses, just trying to identify what would, I would say, be meaningful without being, again, that's sort of, again, the balance of if you start having $50,000, then the requirements in terms of stewardship of dollars as well probably increases. So we were trying to be able to be nimble and provide some initial dollars early up front. So that's where we end up with the $10,000.
I appreciate that. I know this is a informational item, but I did just want to state that given that even at the $10,000 level, if I'm understanding it, it seems like we would require profit and loss statements at that level for it to show the direct impact of businesses. I would personally be supportive of looking for ways to increase that dollar amount, because if we're assuming we're going to have that kind of diligence, then it seems like many businesses could be impacted on a scale more than $10,000. So I just think that that amount could be raised for what probably, considering that not everyone's going to apply, not everyone will show that kind of impact. Probably a modest investment overall that can make a big difference to individual businesses. And so if that's an item for discussion later, I'd be interested at a future point. But really appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, again, we welcome input as we're refining it.
Okay, Director Jane.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm maybe a little bit behind here. I'm trying to understand the timeframes, and we're doing single bore to minimize the disruptions. So it's 5 miles of underground single bore, and we're going to be opening up vents and stations and so on. But when does it start? When does the disruptions start? And how long is it going to be? And then is it progressive? Like as the tunneling happens, I guess from Santa Clara to San Jose, does the vents that we're opening, does the tunnel have to go past there before we start doing that work? And then is it full road closures? I'm trying to understand the magnitude of the disruptions and how long we expect them to be on each block or section. And then is it full road closures? And then do we have a radius? Like if we're going to open up a vent, is there like a radius that you define that within 300 feet, 500 feet, that's what the businesses that we look at? And then really I'm trying to understand is how will people know when this work starts that to avoid driving down there? Do we have webcams, or will we have a real-time website that shows where the closures are, day to day, so that people can know to avoid certain sections? I'm trying to understand how that's going to work, because it's not going to be for the full 7 years.
Yeah, Director Jane, I'll start out. First of all, we will very clearly lay out what construction will be done when. And for example, the work that we've been doing in preparation of the launch facility at the future Newhall Yard area, we've already got our construction transportation management plans out, which will lay out also the scope of the work and the impacts. So then we'll be able to notify people well in advance of when the construction will be taking place in the various locations. And then I'll pass it back to Clarence to talk a bit more about the notification processes.
Right. So again, as part of that overall process, and I'll just sort of describe it real simply. I mean, it'll start at Newhall. There will be some activities in advance of those activities. There will be notices placed out. that construction activity would basically initiate the availability of those direct financial assistance dollars. So if there is no activity there yet, those direct financial assistance dollars aren't available for those businesses within 500 feet of that above-ground construction, right, or staging.
You're saying it's 500 feet is
Correct.
sort of the radius that you're using? Okay, and so then there will be a website that'll clearly say where the construction is happening, real-time, day-to-day?
Correct.
Very good, okay. And then are there full, as I said, are there full road closures, or are there, is it going to be like partial road closures for traffic?
Yeah, Director Jane, we will avoid at all costs, we'll avoid at greatest length possible any full road closures. There will be partial road closures in certain locations, especially at where we're excavating for the station entrances and some of the early work packages. But we're doing everything possible to avoid any full road closures.
Very good, thank you.
Director Chavez.
Thank you. Did everybody else get to go already? I can wait.
Do we have anyone else? Director Montano.
Clip mic.
And Director Fuller.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Chair Burt, and also thank you, Mr. Ng, for your presentation. Appreciate it. I'll be brief. So I wanted to find out, oh, and also thank you for being proactive, the staff for being proactive. I think it's really important that we think ahead about how these impacts are going to affect the businesses in that area. So my question is, the $3 million from that business resource program, does that also include the program elements, that is direct financial assistance of $2 million? Is it
Correct.
all together, or is that additional?
It's all
I'm sorry, what?
total. The combined for all four elements are $3 million annual is what we're
Yeah,
anticipating right now.
I see $2 million.
Inclusive of the $2 million.
Yeah, I see $2 million, but, and you said the whole budget is $3 million annual program budget.
So there's
So
about
that
an extra 500 for the other three elements in terms of, preparing signage, the shop local marketing, as
Right.
well as the business resource.
But in my opinion, it's really only $1 million for when you break it down, because it's $2 million, but the whole budget is $3 million, but you're taking $2 million for the direct financial assistance. In my opinion, that's really not enough. I know you have to do cost savings, but businesses. You mentioned there's 300 eligible businesses, but there really are more than 300 businesses in that corridor. It's just we're trying to be business friendly, because that's really the backbone of America, the small businesses. And I'm just wondering why so little, $3 million, because that's not, in my opinion, that's really not enough. But I'm just one person making that opinion. Also, you mentioned about direct financial assistance requires proof of loss of statements. How do you prove that? Do you look at their tax receipts or sales tax receipts, or how do you prove it?
So we are currently working, again, with our legal to refine that criteria. At the minimum, we have, again, statements that they'll have to sign, and again, in terms of attesting of loss and of income, if you wish. As we discussed earlier, we were trying to balance that out with the I'll call it the greater requirements of Alum Rock, where people actually have to come in with, let's say, tax returns and that. We're trying to avoid that, so we're trying to work through a middle ground where we can have a sense of, again, that those businesses that are applying are deserving of it, and that they can meet that criteria. So we are currently working through some of those details right now.
Yeah, okay. Well, I just wanted to make that my point, my opinion, so. All right, thank you.
Director Foley.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, and I really appreciate the focus on small businesses and helping our small businesses, but I have a couple of follow-up questions. Yeah, I appreciate the grants, but I'm not sure the grants are big enough, actually, to help our businesses make it through this disruption. How long or how complicated will it be for these small businesses to get the funds? You mentioned that if they want 1,000, it's easier, 2,000, it's a little bit more complicated, 10,000, it's a little more complicated, but I worry that we put small businesses through a lot of hurdles and they don't have a legal team who's prepared to fill out the paperwork like we saw with the PPP bailout during the COVID. So help me understand how easy the process is going to be for our small businesses.
Yeah, so I would say for the first $3,000, it should actually be pretty simple, right? There's a form that you meet requirements and that you'll be able to sign and be able to show in terms of proof of disruption. So for instance, because we know when the construction is scheduled, we can, again, look at a map and say, you're within this area, your business is located here, the construction occurred between this time and this time, based on the construction schedule, and that should be pretty straightforward. Again, when you get into the greater than the 6 months to up to the $10,000, that's where we're gonna want a little bit more, again, trying to figure out what that is without necessarily having to bring, profit loss statements, income taxes. We're trying to avoid that in terms of that level of requirement, but we're trying to, again, make it as straightforward as possible, especially for those small businesses who just need that little helping hand right off the start. And so I hope that answers your question.
It does a little bit. I appreciate it, and I know you're thinking about it, and that the conversation we're having today may not be how it's actually implemented when the time comes. So I appreciate you taking our questions. What do we mean by continuous disruption? When we use that terminology, what do we mean by that?
So there was a slide earlier that showed, let's say, for instance, again, most of the activity is going to happen behind fencing, right? But there might be sidewalk closures. So maybe your sidewalk's closed for, a month. Or there's a temporary lane closure, or maybe change of traffic movement around. Maybe there's parking. Those are the things that we're anticipating as continuous. So it's not as if like someone suddenly just put a no parking sign and then you're disrupted for, that is not the same level of, temporary closures of facilities.
Okay, thank you. And one final question. We're going to be cutting off the streets to access, putting up maybe temporary sidewalks. How are we addressing ADA compliance during the construction period for our small businesses?
Those requirements are met.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are relative, compared to what Hallam Rock or the First Street Light Rail or what LA Metro is doing or San Francisco is doing, there will be pockets that will be impacted, and the kinds of impact around them are going to involve the ability to get in and out, basically with trucks. As Gary said, we're going to do our best to avoid complete street closures. Again, I think if the board had opted to go with the twin bore approach, this would be a massively different project. So none of this is in stone, and as you know, we're being proactive, and we are trying to listen and to do the best for the neighborhood, and at the same time to be sensitive to, the taxpayers are paying for this.
Great. I really appreciate that. And just a final comment. I'm really grateful to hear there's a separate program for relocations if that becomes necessary, and I'm sure it will for some of our businesses. And the other thing I want to just throw out there is it's not just access to walking into the storefront. We may be disrupting connectivity, Wi-Fi issues, internet accessibility, and that may be harder for the business to document, but it may be critical to how the business performs in their work. So I want to make sure that we're taking that into consideration in disruption.
Sure.
Thank you.
Director Chavez.
Thank you. And I do just want to say thank you to my colleagues for being so thorough. Here are some requests that I would like to make of the staff. One is that I think it would be very important to have the business disruption protection plan in writing so that the board has an opportunity to evaluate everything from the scope to understanding why we're making certain determinations relative to funding. In addition to that, determining under what terms and conditions somebody is available to access the program. And that way, once we have an opportunity to review it, I actually think the board should take a formal action on the plan so that we all really deeply understand it. So that would be my first request. My second is that we should do something similar with the communication plan. And the reason is that for both the business plan and the communication plan, and I want to talk about financing next, understanding who all the partners are that we're engaging with is really important. So for example, Clarence is our partner with Kimley Horn. I don't know if Kimley Horn's actually running the business program, but I personally would really like to understand who is accountable for each element of the program, particularly given how large this is and how many moving pieces there are. So the comms plan, from my perspective, should also include something that I think, I can't remember which colleague mentioned this, but we're going to have a communication issue relative, well, we have many, but one of them is going to be that we are taking a very different tact relative to the construction activities here. But when you say you have something being constructed in downtown San Jose or in the city of Santa Clara, you're going to have people avoiding the area. And so really thinking through how the comms plan layers up with the business plan, to me, is very critical. So I'd actually like to see that written out with the timelines that Member Jane asked for. The other thing I wanted to just highlight is that we have not yet seen a financial framework for the overall BART project. Now, I recognize that part of the reason for that, Gary, is that we're still working with the VTA on what the actual number is and with our contractors. But the reason that's so critical, and I would just say this is to my colleague, well, there's an obvious reason, which goes back to what, Jim, you just said, this is taxpayer money. But the second that is really, really important for us to understand is, at what points does it make sense for us to rebid components of it? I don't know if it ever would, but we don't have a way of understanding that, absent understanding the financial framework that you're using to make decisions about, we move on Path A under this time frame or Path B under this time frame. I, for one, would really like to understand that, recognizing that we would be using a number that is somewhat dated based on all the work that's already been done. And then as a piece of that, again, for me, this should be in writing, is you have a third-party analysis, which I think is brilliant. We should always do that. Who's the third-party analytics being developed by, and who are those partners? Because I think that, again, would give the board the confidence to understand the implications of any kind of cost escalation. I know you noted that as a labor issue. I frankly think we could also, there are other challenges that we're going to have to face. I think the board should just be aware of them, and I think if it were written out, it would be more helpful. Then lastly, while we're not discussing the relocation program today, I did hear my colleagues' concerns about that, and I have a request relative to our relocation program, and that is, I think it's really critical that we have an outside audit of that program in real time. And the reason for that is that I think it's very important for us to know that we are following all the rules and regulations that the federal government requires us to do in real time as we're getting feedback and concerns from folks that we're interacting with. So that to me is something that if any of these need to require a separate board action, I can wait till the referral part of our agenda, but these are, I think this would help us all respond to the complexity of the program before us if we could ask the staff to move forward in that direction. Did anything I raise have a concern for any of the staff or my colleagues? Okay, then here's just my last comment. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Director Chavez, if you could include that as part of the motion, I think would be appropriate.
Well,
May I
this
take a
is,
motion on this? I'm not sure.
so it's
yeah.
listed as an informational item.
So this is
Yeah.
general direction, and, yeah, and I'm happy
Okay,
to
if you would please, under items of referral, if you could just mention it.
I'll restate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and then just my last comment on just for my colleagues' edification is that the approach we're taking on the business, with our businesses is one that this board actually recommended to staff based on our experience with our bus rapid transit program. And the reason I am emphasizing that is that the approach we took with bus rapid transit was different than the approach this board has taken relative to how we handle disruptions and our responsibility for them. In the past, the way this has been addressed, and if you go back pre-you and pre-me even, my goodness, Jim, when we were looking at the light rail in downtown, it was actually the city's redevelopment agency that partnered to fund and try to protect as many businesses as we could along that light rail alignment. And we've done that a few times. I think what is good about this program is it's more accepted that transportation agencies play a leadership role in this now. It wasn't at the time, honestly. And so I, for one, the reason I'm so interested in seeing the plan in writing is I want to make sure that we're living up to the obligations or the aspirations of the board relative to the next steps in this regard, particularly given our recent experience and what we've learned from that. So thank you, colleagues.
Okay, I think that concludes this informational item, and then when we have referrals at the end, we'll revisit that. So given that we have these two consent items that we want to act on, what I'd like to do is address those at this time, and then item 5.3, which is the Visionary Transit Network, that we would take that up if time permits. So if that's okay, then we'll return to first item 4.1, which is authorization of the GM to execute a contract for the yard maintenance, yard management solution. And Director Jane, you requested to have this polled, so would you like to speak?
Yes, I just have a few questions. I fully agree the need for this yard maintenance. It will streamline operations, make it easier for the operators. But in the city of Santa Clara, typically when we get our board packets, we have the list of all the bids, all three bids, what the prices were, and then the scope of work, which I didn't see in this packet. But when I look at, I did get those just before this meeting, and when I look at the bids, I see that Clever Devices was 3.7 million, Ubisense was 2.2 million, and Vontas was 4 million. So I know that we go with the lowest responsive bidder, but Ubisense is far off from the other two, and so I'm concerned that perhaps they may not perform, they may not give us the same service that we're getting from the others. I trust the staff did the due diligence, I just want to ask the question. So why is Ubisense so far below the other two bidders?
Thank you, Board Member Jane. I'm Juni Tolosa, VTA Technology Manager. We went through, all of these are well documented. VTA goes through, this is actually an RFP, and cost is one of the factor, but not lowest bidder. In the board memo, you'll see the categories that we went through to choose a vendor, a good vendor that we will partner with. We will typically not release the information publicly on the other bidders' cost proposals, including even our independent cost estimate, because it loses our leverage when we go through negotiations. So we went through a rigorous process of the RFP to conduct an evaluation of each of every vendor. It just so happens in this case, the vendor of choosing is the most cost-effective one. But not only that, as we've stated on the board packet, is also the most, in all the evaluations, actually scored the most in terms of technology aspect, software functionality, and also their work plan.
Very good. I'm happy to move this approval.
So that's motion by Director Jane, second by Director Davis. All right. Do we have any members of the public who
We
wish
do
to
not
speak on
have any hands raised, Chair.
Thank you. So then, would the clerk please call the roll? Oh,
Yes, I'm sorry.
oh, voice vote is fine? Oh, yes. Okay. You want to note that, and Director Blankley is now joining us officially?
Alternate board member Turner will be voting on behalf of member Blankley.
Great, thank you.
Correct.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously. Okay. So we can now move on to item 4.2, which is approval of the Auditor General's recommended work plans and projects for fiscal years 2024 and 2025. Director Jane.
Yes, I see on the auditor's list of action items, there is a review of the BART Phase 2 there. But, you know, when I look at the history of this BART Phase 2 project, I see that we had originally estimated it to be at 6.9 billion, and then the feds came to us and said, no, 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 that's way off. It's 9.2 billion. And meanwhile, you know, we're hearing from TACUS that pardon? No, before. Yeah, yeah. Meanwhile, we were hearing from TACUS, oh, we have all these innovations. It's going to, you know, the feds are off. And now I find that, well, it's actually going to be more than 9.2 billion. So I really see that as a failure of our auditing process, that we didn't have that visibility as the board. And so I'm really asking that, and I know in the presentation earlier, they talked about the independent cost estimates and formal value engineering, but I really see that this is something that we need to have a very strong auditing role of schedules and costs. And, you know, I know that Gary had shown us the expenses, I think it was slide 7 of the presentation. But, you know, whenever I see expenses in the city of Santa Clara, we have our expenses and then we have what's budgeted. So I should always be able to see expenses and what's budgeted to see how we're tracking. Now, Gary did say we're below the budget, but it's always nice to see those numbers there. So I'm just asking that we really prioritize the auditing, the function of this project, because I'm nervous. All big projects like this are almost always over budget and delayed. So that's why I see it's there, but I just want to make sure that it's a high priority for us.
Greg, did you wish to speak?
I wasn't sure if, I'll offer it from this perspective. I think there's some clarity that's probably needed as it relates to the question you're asking and where we are within the project. I think as we evaluated the overall program, the timing of when we would be doing our internal work combined with what the FTA is doing from their risk evaluation, that is the process to identify where is the project from a dollar cost perspective. Then I would see where the AG would come in once those are set, making sure that we are then following that plan. I don't know if there's I don't know if there's value now in the AG coming in at this point with those two different risk evaluations being done. Not opposed to it, but that's where I think maybe Scott might be able to provide a little clarity on maybe what he could be doing versus the risk assessment of cost versus what he would evaluate as the process that we're following from cost versus actual versus budget scenario.
And I will ask Scott to weigh in on that. I would just add that we really have two aspects to the risk assessment and the plan that we have. One is the sequencing and when we would do a given audit, and we have this question of what's the right timing so that what Scott would do would really be at the right point in time to add that value. But the other is actually in our in the report that we have of the we have a heat map of comparative risks, and I would very much concur with Director Jane that this risk is at the top of this agency's concerns, and that under the heat map it's high, but it's not blazing red. And I think it does warrant being elevated in terms of how we rate the risk level. We've heard from Gary Griggs and Greg that we continue to see costs in this sector of construction and otherwise, and interest rates continue to climb. And so I think this is really appropriate to have this discussion. Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Vice Chair and members of the board, I really appreciate the opportunity to address this particular issue. I thought it might be beneficial just to give a really quick background, because I haven't had the opportunity to meet a number of board members. I was appointed as the Independent Auditor General about 3 years ago through a competitive process. And I'm a partner at Macias, Gini, and O'Connell, MGO. I work in the advisory group. I've been there for about 8 years. But prior to that, I spent a good part of my career in Silicon Valley, working in public finance and administration. So I actually worked in this building for a couple of years as Controller Treasurer for the county. I worked in the city of Milpitas as the finance director. I was a finance director in San Jose during one of the most exciting times in the buildup of capital I was the finance director there, financing the new city hall, the new airport, and a number of other projects before moving on to the city of Oakland. So I do understand the issue, and as the chair had mentioned, we have gone through a comprehensive risk assessment, and this particular project has been identified in kind of the medium-high risk area. Over the past 2.5 years, we actually conducted 2 other assessments related to the BART project that were submitted to the G&A committee, and then they were put on the agenda for the board. In those assessments, we looked at contract management and oversight and looking at pre-construction costs. But in our discussions with a number of the board members and talking to staff, and also Mr. Griggs had mentioned that he would like to see a focused effort from the Independent Auditor General in regards to the project. So with the input of the board members, G&A, the interview process, we agree that this is an area that needs attention. And in our proposed work plan, we developed kind of a high-level scoping of what we were recommending to do. We are planning to do a focused risk assessment related to the program. In addition, on top of that, based on discussions at G&A, it was requested that the AG also do ongoing monitoring of the project. So we are planning to do quarterly reports to G&A that will then be submitted to the board for your review. And I welcome any input, any requests, from any of the board members on any areas that you would like to look at. When we do the focused risk assessment for the BART project, I'll be reaching out to each board member and giving you the opportunity to interview with us, tell us your thoughts, areas that you'd like us to focus on. So it's very important these types of projects are reviewed and are transparent in regards to the budget, the timeline, the scheduling, the monitoring, and so on. And so those are some of the factors that we plan to look at throughout the various projects related to the BART Silicon Valley Extension Program.
Scott, if right now we have that set of actions that you would have commencing in the second half of this new fiscal year, is that timing right given, or is it more appropriate perhaps that some of this would be in Q2 of this fiscal year?
I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, I think, given the conversations that we've had with the board members, what we typically will do is a pre-assessment process. So assuming that the board would approve the work plan, come July, this is starting fiscal in July 1st, come July, we would start our pre-assessment of the monitoring and starting gathering documents, starting doing some of the interviews and so on, so we could get ahead of the curve and not wait until the federal government completes their risk assessment.
Okay. Colleagues, anyone else wish to weigh in on this? Director Montano?
Yeah, I'm just glad that Director Sutz brought this up. This is very crucial. It's like, why wasn't it done before? Anyway, I'm glad that you brought that up. Thank you.
So given what you just commented, Scott, do we need to, in the motion to approve your work plan, do we need to note that modification of the pre-assessment, or is that implied in the sequencing that you already have in the plan?
I think it's implied because in our report, we do mention that the timing of all these projects are based on, staffing, availability of the administration and so on. So I think we already have, we would have the flexibility to start that immediately.
Okay. And I neglected to see if members of the public wish to speak on this. No hands, thank you. Director Jane.
With that clarification, I'm happy to make the motion to approve the recommended work plan.
That was seconded by Director Lee. And with the voice vote, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That passes unanimously. All right, thank you. So we can now return to item number 5.3, which is adoption of the Visionary Transit Network, VTA's vision and framework for aspirational transit service in Santa Clara County. Janice Serrano Ramos, Senior Transportation Planner, will provide our presentation. Welcome.
Okay. Good. Okay, great. Can you all hear me okay? Good morning, board. I am beyond thrilled to share what the Visionary Transit Network would have in store for our future. So thank you for attending your second board meeting this month to act on this item. To get us started, we can go to the second slide here. Yeah, yes, perfect, this slide. To get us started, I want to talk a little bit about what the Visionary Network is. It's our guiding North Star we'll turn to for implementing our transit service. It's a shared vision for transit that's backed by feedback from our riders, from our cities, and also from strong service planning principles that's focused on fast, frequent, reliable transit. And it's also a framework, most importantly. This framework is going to establish how we're going to achieve aspirational levels of service for our county in phases. So I want to reiterate, this is not intended to be a detailed plan like the ones we typically develop annually, nor is it a plan that is only going to talk about what transit service is necessary for the future. This Visionary Transit Network really sets a high bar for what transit service is necessary and what our county deserves today in today's conditions. Next slide, please. I think I can control the slides too. Okay, thank you. So that said, this morning I am here to look for your adoption of this Visionary Transit Network service vision and its framework. This has been in the making for the past 7 years as we work towards better understanding our riders' needs and identifying strong service planning principles that truly serve our community, all starting with our transit network redesign back in 2016. This visionary network is a central strategy to VTA Forward Plan, which reimagines our service and will grow our service into the future. Next slide. Of course, there are so many testaments I really want to share from the community, but I will just say it's been incredible to get the overwhelming amount of support from the community, as you can see from several of the letters that have been included in your packets. When we spoke with riders, community-based organizations, residents, we also had visioning sessions with some city staff. We really heard a lot of visions for better transit that intersected on fast, frequent, reliable transit. And one thing I really want to pull up here is one comment that I really saw resonate was, it would help my city become a place where I can thrive and can have access to more opportunities. Next slide. So diving right into the principles, I really want to say this is a transit network, this visionary transit network really includes something for everyone. More frequent service on every route, which would also deliberately improve regional connections. You'll see longer hours of operation in this proposal. You'll also see more service on weekends, a much more easy to remember weekend service schedule. And even when we talk about service to new areas, or even innovative transit solutions, the visionary network also carves out space for how we can explore those options as the demand grows for them. Next slide. When you apply those principles to today's transit network, I want to show you how it all turns out. First, I'll reiterate, every single route in our transit network would get more service. And by far, the most game-changing proposal that we have in this plan would be the move from a 10-minute frequent network from today's 15-minute frequent network. And this would apply to all of the routes that you see in red on our system maps. Our local buses, which are typically shown in blue on our system maps, would all come every 20 to 30 minutes, 7 days a week. And this is a vast improvement compared to today's service, which in some cases, these routes only come once an hour. Second, as I lightly touched on earlier, the visionary network really introduces a framework for exploring new service models as well as new transit services as the demand warrants on those. Next slide. So I think I've mentioned plenty how much of a game changer frequency is going to be on our network. And I really want to drive this point home by also showing how meaningful this is going to be for our riders from a point of access of opportunity. We have this incredibly powerful tool that we call Remix, and this is a tool that allows us to create these beautiful isochrone maps that shows how much farther you can travel within 30 minutes with this visionary network. So for instance here, I have dropped off Jane at the Gilroy Transit Center, and I'm able to do this virtually anywhere in our network at any time of day. But in this case, she's at the Gilroy Transit Center on a typical weekday morning. In the visionary network, the transit center would be served by one 10-minute frequent route and 4 local 20 to 30-minute routes. You would reach more areas of the city within 10 or 20 minutes with this improved local service, and it would reach about 10% more people and 10% more jobs. On the next slide, I've placed Jane at the Winchester station in Campbell on a typical Saturday afternoon. In this visionary network, she would have access to a 15-minute light rail line on weekends, a 15-minute bus route, and a 20-minute bus route. You're now able to reach downtown Los Gatos as well as downtown San Jose from the Winchester station within 30 minutes reach. And you would also reach roughly 20% more people and a quarter more jobs within that 30 minutes. And finally, on the next slide, let's place Jane at the Diridon station in downtown San Jose on weekday afternoons. It's needless to say that this is a huge regional transit hub that already benefits and is very transit rich by both local and regional connections. And it also has, in the visionary network, it would have several 10-minute frequent routes and a 10-minute light rail service. Jane's reach within 30 minutes goes much farther into East San Jose, along North First Street, and she would reach nearly 50% more people and 30% more jobs within that 30-minute time frame. Next slide. We have several near-term and long-term opportunities ahead of us to work this visionary in, so there really is no better time than now to get an aspirational transit network for VTA adopted. First, we immediately expect to use this as our blueprint for VTA's annual transit service plans. And I'll note that this is where the detailed plan is going, the detailed planning and the detailed implementation phases are going to happen. Second, this is an adopted transit vision that will guide our county's long-range transportation plan. And this vision will help lead it straight towards projects that will truly get this visionary network to come to fruition. And finally, this agreed upon North Star for transit in our county is really necessary, not just for VTA. Our cities would have to have a North Star as well, so that they can plan their cities to really support transit. And for the longest time, VTA's just been longing to set this really high bar for transit as we grow into the future and continue to serve our growing population. This next slide here will really drive that point home. This is an ambitious transit vision, but it's exactly what we need if we expect to keep our service levels on par with our growing population. Today, we're still running at 1990s levels of service, and we've been underserving our population for the past couple of decades. On the next slide, you'll also see that we've been underserving our population when you see how our service per capita compares against both our local and our national peers. I'll mention this metric includes everything else beyond just fixed route transit. It includes paratransit, it includes demand responsive service, as well as van pool services if these transit agencies offer them. And of course, you'll see that the visionary network is very, very ambitious, but it's also a really reasonable ask when you look at how it compares to our peers such as AC Transit and Denver. Those are two peers whose level of service in urban and suburban contexts are ones that we feel we should be emulating as a county. On the next slide. Our team did an assessment to roughly quantify the costs and the impacts of implementing this visionary transit network today. Compared to today's annual operating costs, it would cost an additional 44% more a year to operate, but that additional annual investment would provide an 83% boost in transit service. And it could also attract up to 70% more riders compared to today. Keep in mind, that's just with today's context. It doesn't incorporate future land uses, future street network and development, but it's today's context, today's land uses, and today's street network. So imagine how much more that would develop over time. Next slide. To implement this vision in its entirety will obviously take years, if not decades. And of course, it'll take place in multiple phases. We also have capital projects that are necessary. Capital projects such as transit speed improvements, which include bus lanes, signal priority, and the like. And these really should be pursued immediately and in partnership with our cities so that we can better our chances of implementing this higher level of service at much lower operating costs. We also have other capital needs such as additional vehicles and storage and double tracking along our green line. These are especially critical to ensuring we can deliver on the 10-minute frequent service that we propose in this plan. Next slide. So as I get close to wrapping up here, as we think of all of the elements that are truly going to attract our riders and to public transit over any other mode, this is what comes to mind, this very common image that I'm sure that you've seen applied in all sorts of industries, but this common image of a three-legged stool comes to mind. We know that our member agency cities have long been working and doing their part to pull more transit users in by attracting more transit service, whether it means through influencing transit placement through transit supportive land uses. It could also mean how they've been working towards designing street networks that really balance mobility and accessibility priorities, and also striving for safe, walkable environments. The way I see it is that this visionary transit network is VTA's match to that commitment, to these really important efforts. We really want to be back on track to contributing more transit service to support their cities and their goals in sustainable ways and to earn every rider back, especially following the pandemic. And so that brings me to my final slide. By now, I hope I have you believing in transit and really believing how transformational this is going to be for our riders and for VTA and for our cities, for everyone really. This is an adopted service vision and net framework that the agency really needs today, and we really want to make sure we can keep our eye on the prize here. I know it's ambitious, but it is very meaningful, and I really wholeheartedly believe that this is an achievable plan. But of course, the work doesn't stop here. This is just the work that jumpstarts the work for what we have left to do. We've got future efforts that will involve identifying new operating funds to cover these additional operating costs, look for ways where we can pursue grants for those really important capital projects, and of course, the big one here is to, once we get those funds sorted, we'll then begin to identify implementation phases over time. So with that, thank you again so much for hearing this item and for acting on it. It really means a lot to staff. It sure means so much to our riders, as you can see through the letters of support, and for our cities who have really dedicated their time to help shape this vision with us. Looking forward to the discussion and your questions.
Great. Thank you, Janice. Let's now take public comments.
We have 2 members of the public with their hands raised, 3. We'll begin with Eugene, followed by Monica. Eugene, please accept the unmute and begin speaking when ready.
Morning, board members and staff. Eugene Bradley, Silicon Valley Transit users. Thank you for the excellent presentation. To say this is long overdue is just an understatement. It's great that you've admitted to not only having a problem, that you've actually committed to actually solving that problem. So yes, thank you. Somebody who used to live in Sunnyvale, this is much welcome. The fact that in many cases, a lot of the buses outside of San Jose and Santa Clara run up to every 30 to 60 minutes, not good for relieving traffic. To see long-term plans for how those buses run about every 20 to 30 minutes, yes. Light railroading every 10 minutes, definite yes. So let's do what's necessary to help make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up will be Monica. After Monica, we'll begin with Matthew. Monica, please accept the unmute and begin speaking when ready.
Hi, this is Monica Mallon, just speaking on behalf of myself. Really want to encourage you all to support the Visionary Transit Network. I think this is a really great vision and staff did an amazing job with it, and I think it's really exactly where we need to head. It's something that's going to make transit a much better option for residents in all of your cities and all parts of the county. And one of my favorite aspects is that the service frequency and hours are based on the service category and not the population of the cities or areas it serves. It gives each community the service they need to drive ridership in a fair way. And I think that's really important because every city and every jurisdiction is part of VTA and obviously contributing. I also just want to emphasize that this is a really important moment. This is a moment when you're setting a bold vision for the future at a time when most agencies are having the opposite conversation. And you're directing staff to take the next steps. So really want to encourage you to take pride in this vote. And when this vision is realized someday, I really hope that you'll look back on this moment and remember it.
Thank you. Matthew, please accept the unmute and begin speaking when ready.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Lundy. I grew up in Morgan Hill, went to school in San Jose, and I just want to also voice support for this. Spending so much of my time in and around all the cities of South Bay, public transit so often feels like not an option or not like a feasible option. So big steps like this are absolutely what I think we need. And especially in a overall metro area, the Bay Area, when you have other agencies like Muni and AC Transit doing a lot of service, I think service increases like this, better frequency, better feasibility is really important to step up our game, basically. So yeah, I really just full support for this for me. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a phone number ending in the digits of 8150. Please accept the unmute and begin speaking when ready.
Good morning, board members and staff. This is Doug Muirhead, Morgan Hill resident. I appreciate the aspiration of the visionary network. I see the 90% ridership and 10% coverage split to be a pre-COVID daily commuter model, and would like that 90-10 split reconsidered for the visionary network. Thank you.
And there are no more hands raised, Chair.
All right, thank you. We'll now close public comment on this item. Questions and comments from colleagues? Director Jane?
I really love the 10-minute headways. I think that when we have headways of 30 minutes, it's a real impediment to getting people to use the transit. And I know it's very aspirational, but, you know, the money is always an issue. And so we're talking about, you know, $430 million baseline operating. We're adding $190 million to that to implement this. In addition, 300 more buses at $300 million. We can get grants for that, I can see that. But for the operating costs, $190 million, can you talk to that?
In order for us to find a way to cover that additional 190 million, we would have to identify a completely new operating source for operating funds. We may have to get creative, whether it's through another sales tax measure or through another ballot measure. I know some examples that we've also seen out there are transit network company taxes that can then go towards transit operations. So I think there's several creative ways we can look to cover that additional 190 million annually, but we have yet to see what sort of opportunities we can speak to, hopefully starting this summer and onward.
So this is just really aspirational, but how does it sort of guide us, I mean, to get to the aspiration?
Director Jane, I'm Jay Tyree, manage the service planning team at VTA. It's a good question. This is the first step to establish where our vision is, where we want to go in the future. Because if we've learned anything in the transit world, is that you want to have a vision of where you want to be, and then it's all about timing. And there's going to be, we acknowledge this is bold. There will have to be some conversations about new revenue sources, maybe new taxes, like the TNC tax that Janice said. But you have to kind of strike at the right moment, and you have to kind of take advantage of the moment when it comes. And we don't know when that moment will be. And so, in 5 years, if suddenly it becomes a possibility that we might explore a TNC tax or any other kind of revenue source, then we want to strike. But the point of it is we'll have this network that can guide us in the interim. And the other thing I want to say is, this doesn't have to be all at once. It's not $190 million or none, right? We can, if we get a small increase in revenue, we can maybe do the weekday 10-minute network on the bus side and then do light rail next. And so we can implement this in phases. So all of that is, we don't want to predetermine that at this point. We just want to set the vision, and then the rest can happen at future discussions.
Greg, did you want to wade in?
Jay said it all right there. Thank you very much.
Director Turner.
Thank you. And it sounds like because of funding that the phasing would be necessary in order to make this work. And so in order to remain unbiased amongst my colleagues here, would South County get the highest priority? I just thought I would ask.
Of course. We would certainly make that a consideration.
Well, with all the Morgan Hill residents calling in, we've got to represent them. So thank you for that. Again, and I did see that that South County obviously was represented in that. I just wanted to make sure that in fact that would be obviously we're concerned about transportation and opportunities in South County. So I appreciate being considered in that along with those frequencies and services. So thank you.
And I see that our CEO, Carolyn Gannott, would like to wade in.
Good morning. I guess it's almost afternoon. I just want to let you know, I've really encouraged this work for us to making sure that our county, what do we need in our county in terms of transit services to be more, really a product that people will use more. And the other thing that, and that I think the county deserves, actually. The thing that Janice talked about as well was about wanting to have types of service where, I'm sorry, the network is, oh, just a minute.
Clearly another transit fan.
I'm sorry, I'm with my sister today, and she has 3 dogs who just decided to start barking as I'm talking. I apologize. I also, when it comes to additional revenue sources, we are looking in the future potentially for a regional sales tax, a regional fee, or something that could be potentially go throughout the region. This would be something I think we want to look at. When I start looking at the capital, I mean, the operating costs right now, we're really trying to move those forward. The land uses that are on coming forward as well, which, as Janice mentioned, that was not part of the study. We were just looking at what we would do into, it reflected today's environment. I think what we should do is be ready to take advantage, understand as a board where we want to go, and really message how important it is to put more transit service in Santa Clara County. We're underserving our population, and they deserve stronger transit service to really have that essential to all of our workers and our residents. So I just wanted to make sure that we understand that we don't know what funding would be used. I don't think some of the costs we might be able to handle. We hopefully would increase the amount of fares that we have, so that in particular the fare box ratio that we have. So there's a number of areas where we could potentially see a stronger ridership base, a stronger fare box recovery, a lower operating cost, and a bigger fund source. And I just want to be prepared and ready to take advantage of that and understand how we move forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Director Lopez.
I don't have questions. I just want to say I'm incredibly excited and appreciative of all of your work. And to me, this is exactly what the role of the board should be in helping inform the vision and then working with staff on the implementation. But I'm incredibly excited. I look forward to the conversations about implementation and funding and all those incredibly important pieces that need to get figured out. But I think this is really going to make us a model for transit service, and as Carolyn was just saying, making sure that we're serving our riders in the way that they deserve. So thank you, really appreciative, and couldn't be more excited for this.
And I see that Director Blankley would like to comment as well.
Yes, thank you. So I'm not where I'm supposed to be today to take this meeting, which is why I can't participate as a board member. But I do want to compliment and support this effort because this is exactly where we need to go. I'm going to reiterate, of course, that everything also apply to the Gilroy and Morgan Hill area. I couldn't agree with Carolyn more that what we need to do is see what what will it take for people to use transit service? We're going through the addition of the fourth train now, with Caltrain, we're pushing out that survey. And I, for one, am really, really, really trying to get people who don't even think about public transportation, because here in Gilroy, so many have been trained to just not consider it to exist, to participate in that survey, because how will we know what services will get people out of their cars if we don't get them to speak up, or if we don't increase the frequency that makes them realize this could work for them? So just like what Sergio was saying before, thank you so much for going this route, fully supportive. Just, of course, I'm going to be looking to see that it's equal throughout all of us in the county. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Abekoga.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, thank you to staff and for everyone who've worked on this. It is really exciting. I think it's very helpful and necessary. I was going to mention, as our GM mentioned, there's some talk about a regional measure. I've been contemplating, depending on how that unfolds, we could also obviously consider our own. But I think this will be helpful for us to know exactly which way to go. And then a question I had was, as cities develop, for instance, in our city, we are implementing transportation impact fees with new development. And I'm wondering if there's been conversation with the cities about including some of these potential improvements as part of the fees that we would charge in exchange for some sort of commitments, frankly, to enhance service in our communities.
I can't say we've spoken to that extent, but that's the kind of creative thinking we're looking for when it comes to finding these ways to fund these services. So I will definitely note that down. And we have such a great relationship with many of our cities, so I'm sure we'll have opportunities to bring that up. So thanks for that idea.
That would be helpful because, frankly, right now, our impact fees are going towards our city-specific improvements. I always think it's better if we can consolidate and reach efficiencies. But I know from a city we would need those kind of guarantees. But if we can have those conversations, it would be, I think, interesting and worth exploring. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't. Oh. Do I have? Raise your hand if you want to speak.
You can see our lights.
Okay, Director Lee. But some people leave their lights on, so, okay, Director Lee.
Oh, me? Sure. So first of all, I just want to say, having heard the complaints of South County or just South Bay, that our public transportation is not meeting the needs of our residents for so many years or decades. Seeing this report, I'm not only excited, it feels like I'm in the Field of Dreams moment, that we're going to build it, then people will come. At the end of the day, it's really about what? Frequency and reliability for people to decide to use public transportation. The more people ride it, the more federal subsidy money we get. And I think that's the money that we should be focusing on getting, and not the money about this fare box recovery that so many people have also worried about. To increase ridership, I certainly believe there are so many ways we could push it, but by doing exactly what this report is saying is exactly the direction we need to get folks to feel safe, to feel reliable, to use our public transportation. And along with that, I've said this before, I think we need to offer very, very low cost or free rides to, say, students, to children, to seniors, and these are things to get people to actually use our public transportation. So I just want to say, let's not worry too much about the fare box recovery part. When we build the system and when people truly are riding it, the money will come from the feds. And I think that's the ultimate goal for us, is to increase the ridership for so many good reasons I don't have to go into. Thank you.
Director Montano?
Thank you, Chair Burt, and thank you, Ms. Ramos, for your presentation. I do concur with many of my colleagues here that are for this visionary transit network. I think it's way overdue. It's, we live in a fast-paced society. People need to get to point A to point B quickly, and this will really help with that need. So I think it'll increase the ridership. I think it improves the system, our transit system, and most of all, I think it'll it'll really help a lot of students that really need to go to college or high school, and I think you're going to get more ridership. I'd like to see you reach out to the state, because school districts are not required to provide busing anymore, and I think we need to start. They get, for example, in Milpitas, school districts receive like over 45% of our property taxes. So why not? I think reaching out to the school districts would be, I know Director Abikoga mentioned the cities, but why not the school districts as well? Because they're the ones, the students use the services. And just like Director Otto Lee mentioned about the ADUs, I mean, not ADUs, the federal, but it's almost the same thing as school districts. The more students you have, the more the Fed will, the government will give you money with attendance revenues. So I really like this. I think it's the best way to go for the board. So thank you.
Director Chavez?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the report. Two things that I just want to highlight. If we could go back to slide 9. One is that I think, Otto, you raised a really important point a moment ago about under what circumstances will the federal government, and I would just add the state government, start to invest in operations in a more rigorous way versus capital. And one challenge we have is that we as an agency have always had a difficult time with operations. And at no time has the state or federal government thought that was even close to an emergency for Silicon Valley. And I raise that because right now at the state level, there's a huge scramble to move capital dollars to operating dollars because two of our bigger partners, BART and Muni, are very concerned about their financial futures because they're no longer receiving fare box recovery. And so now everybody understands that as an emergency. The problem for our agency has been because of that constraint. You see where we are on the chart. I'm sorry, slide 9 in my packet was the chart with all of the agencies next to each other.
I think it's slide 12. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. And looking at this, it makes a lot more sense for us to be looking like AC Transit than almost any other comparison on this chart. So my point is that I am nervous now that the level of service that we're in today will be locked in the eyes of the state, as the state is going to be pressured to put more resources into operating capital. And what I want to make sure of, and colleagues, that we had a discussion about the financial health of VTA, and instead of doing one more ad hoc committee, because I swore I would never be on another one, and we've only done 4,000 of them, I've requested that this discussion actually go through admin and finance, so the board is actually responsible for both digesting the information, getting people to come and speak to it, but also so that we're much better prepared to be able to think through what we'd like our next steps to be. So what I would like immediately to understand is how our level of service that we have today will or will not be our benchmark as we go to work with our sister agencies to get more state and federal investment for operating. I'm very nervous about that, honestly. And the other thing that I want to better understand is how our participation in Clipper or Bay Pass or any of those regional fair tools impacts our overall funding. And I think that should actually go to admin and finance relatively quickly, because when the legislature makes whatever action they're going to take this year, it will be the first, frankly, it will be the first risk we take, because we're going to be locked in, I think, regionally to the service we're providing today versus our ability to expand services. And I'm actually very concerned about that based on the discussions I'm having with folks at the state. And then the second issue is I want to better understand from our team's perspective the opportunities and risks relative to how we look at a regional fair system that could be of benefit to us. Because frankly, based on what Carmen and Otto raised, is we're already pretty inexpensive, and the real question is, can we be less expensive? And I think part of how that gets figured out is what are the implications of a shared fare strategy regionally. So I don't personally think we should take actions on these items until we understand the fare opportunity, because, and not to make this more complicated than it needs to be, but we're seeing some very good outcomes with the Bay Pass, like an increase in ridership, which ultimately our job, we have two of them, is to increase ridership and reduce congestion, because we're a congestion management agency also. So I know that's a lot, but what I'm really requesting is that as part of the financial discussions we're having in admin and finance, that we include in it the visionary network and make some determinations about what actions we need to take in the very, very short term so we're not left behind. And then in the longer term, what options should we be considering for regional, as part of the regional fair discussions, so that the board understands the implications of those choices, and if there are opportunities with those choices relative to the point that Supervisor Lee raised about whether or not that allows us to be more competitive, or not competitive, that's not the right word, really to push the state and federal government to do what every other government throughout the globe does, which is invest in transportation in a much more deep way than either the state or the federal government does. Does that make sense? Are my colleagues comfortable with that? I would like that to be part of the motion. And did someone make the motion already? Oh, I'll move the visionary network framework and request that the two discussions I raised relative to level of service and financing options come through admin and finance as quickly as possible.
Happy second.
Thank you. And I'll just add, under the maxim that everything's been said, but not everyone has said it, I want to really thank all the work that our staff has done and all the partners and community members who have participated in this, and reiterate the value of having this guiding vision, which then allows us to begin to move forward on how we implement it. And I particularly want to thank Vice Chair Chavez for her very valuable strategic thoughts on where we need to go and advocate and pursue certain measures that will be the foundation for being able to implement this. So thanks. And I think we're ready for a vote. Is this a roll call or? Okay. That was Director Lee. Okay, all in favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you. And so we now go on to other items. This is 6.1 is items of concern and referral. And Vice Chair, you had a referral.
I'm referring to staff the following items. An audit of the current relocation organization we have, including the cost of the contract and their compensation strategy to determine whether or not they're following all state and federal laws. Second, that we have a written comms plan that is inclusive of our partners and also the cost of that comms plan for the BART Phase 2, that we get the business protection plan for BART Phase 2, inclusive of partners and costs, and for each of these items that they have a scope attached to them, both for the comms piece as well as the business protection plan. And then finally, that the finance framework is laid out with options and timelines so that the board understands under what circumstances the board may have to make different choices for direction.
Excuse me, Member Chavez, did I hear you say the communication plan as well? I'm sorry.
Correct, yes. Thank you.
Okay, any others? Director Jane.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was looking at taking the bus here this morning, and I went onto the Transit app, and I noticed that Transit Royale, which I had been told was free, is no longer going to be free. So I wanted to understand, they're going to start charging $4.99 a month or $25 a year, which isn't a lot, but for some people it is a lot. So I just wanted to sort of maybe have a discussion in the future about the apps that we have. Transit Royale was supposed to be the, this step up from what we had before, but now it seems like it's going to be for fee.
Director Lopez.
Going back to the business support plan, I'd also like staff to come back with recommendations for potentially increasing the maximum amount of direct assistance that is offered.
If I may, Director Lopez, it's difficult at this point because it is an estimate. With your permission, what I'd like to do is wait until we get a little bit further into this so we have a better understanding of what the overall impact is. You will always have the ability as a board to change that number. That's not going to be impacted. But for us to estimate again, I'm not sure there's a lot of value to it at this point. Do you follow what I'm saying?
May I weigh in on this? So part of the reason I wanted the written plan was because the plan should actually be clear about how each of the sums was arrived at, which would include whether or not we're using the experience we had with Bus Rapid Transit or under what terms and conditions we're using what amount of money. So what I would request is that the framework that's being used or the initial costs are actually explained because then I think it would give the board an opportunity to make changes to it because I think the points you raise are really important, Sergio.
And I'm okay with that. I just want to clarify that I'm referring to the maximum amount offered to individual businesses, not the overall amount of the program, which I understand is a lot more moving parts. But with that, I'm happy to wait for more information. Thank you.
And Director Lee.
I was just responding to Director Jane's earlier comments regarding the Transit Royale. I log on, it says VTA upgraded you to Royale for free. I don't think it's because I'm a director. I think it's just because I'm using VTA. So I just want to say that hopefully that works for everybody. Just want to confirm from staff to confirm that one. Two, of course, this is only one of many apps that we're not necessarily sponsoring any specific app. I mean, you can use Google Map and just say I want to go from A to B, and then there will be suggestions of various type of transits to get through with timing and all that. So these are all great apps that we could use to get people on time and let people know live exactly what time the bus is arriving, which is extremely powerful and useful. Thank you.
I can assure you that the free period was available to all.
Okay. So not seeing any other announcements? All right. We'll, or excuse me, any other referrals? Under announcements, I'd like to invite the board members to attend the graduation of our latest class of bus operators on Wednesday, June 28th at 11 at the Shibuya Yard. The graduation caps off a 9-week training course to maneuver a 20-ton bus through the maze of Silicon Valley streets. We normally have 20 to 30 grads. We'd like to show them our support for completing this course and moving on to serving passengers. classes normally share a great deal of camaraderie and are very proud and excited about their accomplishment. Second, VTA will be participating once again in the Family Giving Trees Back to School Drive. Over the years, our employees have been participating in the Back to School Drive to help students in our county have a great start for the new school year. Beginning next week, they'll have tags for our employees to take to the Back to School shopping. The flyer noted on your screen also has a QR code for virtual donation of the backpack. The board office will send you the flyer so you can participate if you wish. This year, we hope to collect 500 backpacks with supplies to donate to the Family Giving Tree. We'll be delivering the backpacks to Family Giving Tree on July 24th. So now we're in the 6.3, which we don't have any additional public comments. We're now going to have a closed session, and I just want to remind everybody that we need a quorum for the closed session. The board will be discussing item 7.1A, which is noted on the screen. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak on the closed item?
There are no hands raised, Chair.
Thank you. So we'll now close public comment. Thank you, everyone, for attending. The board will go into closed session and be back in 20 minutes or so. Thanks.
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
I'm like, oh my gosh, like, please take this stuff so I'm not.
Quickly.
Yeah, you signed the cover sheet. Here's what I'm looking for.
Okay, we're now back to open session, and would the attorney like to report on the closed session?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The VTA Board of Directors met in closed session and did not take any reportable action.
All right, thank you. And on that note, our meeting is adjourned.
Thank you. We will end the meeting for all now.
Recording stopped.